They laid the convoy's losses across the Babel, and I could trace every sinking back to a line I had drawn on a chart days earlier. My warning had moved through the system in neat folders and carbon copies, registered, circulated, and then buried beneath other papers. In the review I read my own cautious words quoted back to me, followed by a single phrase, filed rather than acted upon. Since then, every pin I press into the Atlantic feels heavier, as if the weight is no longer on the map, but on my hand. In March 1943 in London, the North Atlantic campaign had reached a difficult phase. The winter had been long, the weather severe, and merchant traffic between North America and Britain remained under constant threat from German U-boats. Convoys were still sailing slowly across the ocean. Schedules were tight, escorts limited, head intelligence incomplete. Within the Admiralty building, in a set of crowded rooms that few outside the naval service ever saw, officers, ratings, and civilian analysts tried each step to work out where the threat would fall next. Charts of the North Atlantic were laid out onto the tables and walls. Coloured pins, grease pencil lines, and annotations marked convoy routes, expected U-boat patrol lines and areas of recent attack. Signals from ships, shore stations, and wireless intercept sites arrived throughout the day and night. The information never stopped arriving. In one of those rooms worked a small team attached to the submarine tracking room. Their purpose was straightforward in theory and difficult in practice: to estimate as accurately as possible where German submarines might be operating, and to ensure that their assessments reached those who routed the Allied convoys. Among the officers there was a former barrister turned temporary naval officer, now wearing the rank of Lieutenant Commander in the Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve. He had come to the work through a combination of legal training, good analytical sense, and wartime necessity. His days followed a pattern that rarely changed. Early in the morning he and the others reviewed the overnight signals. There were wireless direction-finding bearings that gave rough arcs where a transmitting U-boat might be. There were sighting reports from aircraft and ships, sometimes delayed by hours. There were decodes of German messages when they were available, although by this stage the German Navy's changes in cipher machines had reduced the volume of readable traffic. There were after-action reports from convoys that had recently been attacked. Each piece of information was partial, sometimes ambiguous, and often out of date by the time it was read. Taken together, however, they formed patterns. Over the preceding weeks, several convoys had been forced to run through areas where U-boat groups had been stationed in depth. Escort commanders reported night attacks by multiple submarines operating together. Losses had been heavy on some routes. The strain showed in the reports written later by the convoy commodores, escort group leaders, and Western Approaches Command. In the London tracking room, the charts told the same story more quietly. Clusters of pins marked sinkings. Lines showed estimated submarine tracks. An impression emerged of German patrol groups extending further into the North Atlantic, away from the areas that had been considered most dangerous earlier in the war. The lieutenant commander spent much of his time comparing yesterday's chart with today's. He would stand with a pencil in hand, looking along the plotted convoy routes, and then along the estimated positions of U-boat patrol lines. When a ship reported being torpedoed at a certain position and time, he adjusted the likely position of the attacking submarine and considered how far and in which direction it might have moved since. He knew that every plot was an approximation. It was not possible to know exact positions, but the patterns still mattered. Routing officers relied on those patterns to steer convoys around danger when they could. The operational situation, as recorded in summary documents at the time, had several constraints. There were not enough escorts to shield every convoy with a strong screen across the entire ocean. Air cover was limited to the areas within range of land-based aircraft from Britain, Iceland, and later Newfoundland and the Azores. The Central Atlantic Gap remained poorly covered. The Germans, for their part, had increased the number of U-boats on patrol. They moved their groups according to their own assessments of where convoys would pass. By 1943 they had experience, operational doctrine, and their own intelligence, including some use of signals interception. The result was a moving contest between Allied routing and German deployment. In this environment, the tracking room's assessments mattered, but so did habit, routine, and the simple fact of distance. Convoys could not be turned sharply at the last moment without disrupting schedules and risking confusion. Routing decisions were taken in good time before departure and at certain waypoints, and the risk that could not be avoided had to be accepted. The lieutenant commander's work appeared in the daily situation reports. These were typed summaries that collated information about U-boat sightings, sinkings, suspected patrol lines, and assessed areas of danger. They were circulated to key sections within the Admiralty and to Western Approaches Command in Liverpool. They did not, by themselves, order any convoy to turn. They informed those who did. As winter turned towards spring, the tracking room staff saw signs that the Germans were increasing their presence along an arc in the mid-Atlantic, up west of the traditional focal areas. Over several days, direction-finding plots and ship reports suggested repeated transmissions in a broad band roughly across the anticipated convoy routes between Newfoundland and the western approaches. Several of the analysts believed that a new patrol line was being formed there. The lieutenant commander drafted a note summarising that assessment. It was not a dramatic document. It ran to a few paragraphs, typed on a standard form. It listed recent transmissions in a series of grid squares, referencing the German naval chart system. It suggested that the number and distribution of those signals did not match single submarines moving independently, but were more consistent with a group being assembled. The note recommended that this possibility be considered in routing eastbound and westbound convoys scheduled for the following week. He did not have authority to issue a directive. He could recommend, and he did so in the language that was customary in such reports: cautious, precise, and hedged where the evidence was thin. The note went into the folder for that day's U-boat situation summary. Attached at the back, it joined several other contributions from different sections: a short appreciation from the meteorological staff, a note on air patrol coverage, and a brief comment from the Anti-Submarine Warfare Division. The combined document was registered, given a reference number, and placed on the distribution list. Copies went to the relevant desks. The system functioned as designed, and no one in the room that day believed the note had been ignored. It had been filed, circulated, and read by several officers, but reading did not always lead to action. At Western Approaches Command in Liverpool, the staff responsible for routing convoys received a constant flow of information. Messages arrived by teleprinter and signal. A wall map showed the position of convoys already at sea, with coloured tags indicating their escort strength. Beside that hung a schedule of forthcoming departures from Halifax, New York, and other North American ports. Routing officers had to weigh the available information against the practical limits. Convoys could not take overly circuitous routes without losing days. Escorts could not be detached and reattached in mid-ocean without careful timing. Weather systems moved across the ocean, complicating any attempt to avoid known danger areas. In the week that the tracking room raised the possibility of a new patrol line, several convoys were due to cross the mid-Atlantic roughly in the same general region. Among them was a slow eastbound convoy of mixed shipping, tankers, freighters, and a few passenger vessels converted to carry cargo. Its escort was adequate on paper, but not unusually strong. The routing staff in Liverpool considered alternative tracks. They had their own assessments of recent U-boat activity, drawn from operational reports and their own reading of Admiralty summaries. There was already a well-known area of danger further south, where previous convoys had been attacked. There were also reports of submarines operating closer to Iceland. Trying to avoid all suspected areas at once was impossible. The convoy's planned route was adjusted slightly north of the most recently reported sinkings. In doing so, the route intersected the broad band where the tracking room believed a new patrol line was forming. The decision reflected the usual balance of factors. The officers involved did not possess a clear map of U-boat positions. They had estimates, some more recent than others, and they had the pressure of keeping traffic moving. The note that had highlighted the possible new patrol line existed in their files. It was one source among many. Its warning had not been marked with the highest urgency. The document did not state that a definite line was in place, only that a pattern seemed to be emerging. The convoy sailed on schedule from the western side of the Atlantic. The merchant ships assembled from different ports formed into columns and set out with their escorts. For the crews aboard, the route was a line on a chart and a succession of positions read out at sea. They had no detailed picture of the operational level arguments that had influenced their path. On the German side, submarines were also moving into position. The headquarters of the U-boat arm had instructed several boats to take up stations along a line calculated to intercept eastbound traffic. Their commanders had experience in this pattern of operations. They were given patrol squares and general guidance, then left to find and report convoys when possible. The Atlantic heat of battle at that time consisted of many such lines, both Allied and German, crossing and occasionally intersecting in ways that only became clear afterward. And when the eastbound convoy approached the central Atlantic, weather conditions were not favourable for air cover. Cloud and distance limited the reach of Allied patrol aircraft. The escorts maintained their screen and the convoy proceeded at its best speed. Signals intelligence at the time recorded an increase in enemy transmissions in the general area, but interpreting those signals in real time remained difficult. Some bearings suggested U-boat presence slightly ahead and to the south of the convoy's plotted track. Other reports indicated contacts further north. In London, the lieutenant commander in the tracking room added new pins and lines to the chart as fresh signals arrived. He saw that the cluster of reported positions, although scattered, reinforced the idea of a group in the area his note had described, and he updated his appreciation and sent it forward as part of the next situation report. The convoy, already at sea, was hours and days away from any point at which a major diversion could be practically ordered and executed. In Liverpool, the staff monitored reports. Wireless silence policies and operational security meant that many convoys transmitted only briefly and at set times. It was often not possible to change course without creating new risks. The Atlantic crossing was long, and decisions taken before sailing shaped most of the risk distribution. As evening came on in the convoy's sector, a submarine picked up the sound of propellers and later the indistinct form of ships on the horizon. A sighting report was transmitted. Other submarines in the area moved to intercept. Over the next hours, contacts multiplied. The German records later summarized that several boats established contact with a large convoy and began shadowing, reporting position and course to their headquarters. For the convoy, the first warning came when an escort reported a probable contact on its ASDIC equipment. The report was routine, false contacts were common, depth charges were dropped and the convoy continued. Shortly afterward, a merchant ship toward the outer edge of one column reported a torpedo wake. That report was followed by an explosion as a ship was struck. Darkness and confusion made it difficult to assess at once how many submarines were present. The escorts maneuvered to confront the attackers, trying to maintain the integrity of the screen. In prevailing conditions, it was standard practice to keep the convoy moving rather than to halt and risk further disorganization. That night and into the following one, the convoy was repeatedly attacked. Submarines approached submerged by day and, when conditions allowed, on the surface at night. The escort commanders tried to respond to each detected threat, but the number of contacts outpaced their ability to counter them all. Ships were struck at irregular intervals. Some managed to stay afloat long enough to be abandoned in some order. Others sank quickly. The convoy commodore transmitted contact and attack reports as permitted by radio silence procedures. These reached shore stations with delay. In Western Approach's command, the operations room added pins indicating reported sinkings. And an overall picture began to form, a convoy under sustained attack in an area where a concentration of U-boats was now indisputable. Diverting other convoys away from the region became an urgent task. For the one currently engaged, options were limited. Signals sent from shore directing a significant alteration of course had to be received, decoded, and implemented by the convoy. In practice, in the middle of a complex night action, large-scale changes were difficult. The convoy's escort commander used his discretion to try minor alterations to confuse the attackers, but the U-boats, operating in a coordinated pattern, kept contact. In London, the tracking room's chart now showed a dense set of indications. The lieutenant commander and his colleagues traced the line of attacks and compared it with their earlier assessments. The area coincided closely with that marked in his earlier note as a probable concentration zone. In the immediate moment, that fact had limited operational value. The priority was to help direct reinforcements, if available, and to adjust other convoy routes. Support groups were dispatched where possible, and air patrols were tasked to search the region when weather permitted. Over the next days, the attacks continued, then slowly diminished as the convoy moved beyond the main patrol area, and as reinforcements arrived. When the surviving ships reached British waters, they were met by harbour pilots and tugs, as routine. For the crews and their commanders, the journey had been marked by losses, but their duty required them to proceed with unloading and turn toward the next tasks. Only later did the longer process of analysis begin. But within the Admiralty, after-action reviews followed a pattern by that stage of the war. Reports from the convoy commodore, escort group leaders, and aircraft that had participated were collected. Operational signals were assembled in sequence. The submarine tracking room contributed its reconstruction of U-boat positions and movements based on the signals they had seen before, during, and after the action. Western Approach's command provided its own narrative of decisions taken regarding routing and reinforcement. The purpose of these reviews was not only to record events, but to learn. The formal style of the resulting documents was often measured, but within them were passages that indicated concern, disagreement, and the search for causes. In the case of this convoy, the analysis soon highlighted a particular question. Had there been sufficient warning in the days before sailing that a German patrol group was forming in the area that the convoy eventually crossed? The tracking room's files contained the lieutenant commander's note. It was referenced by date and distribution. The attached chart showed the band he had sketched as a potential patrol line. The after-action reconstruction showed that the convoy's track had intersected that band near its centre. Meeting minutes from the review conference recorded the discussion. Those present noted that the tracking room had raised the possibility of a group in the area, but that the assessment had been couched in conditional terms. They also noted that Western Approaches Command had already been tracking several known danger areas and had chosen to adjust the convoy's route to avoid one of those at the expense of potential exposure to another. In other words, the decision had been a trade-off, not a simple failure to read a document. Yet the very fact that the earlier note existed, and that it aligned with later evidence, gave it weight. One officer at the meeting remarked, according to the surviving notes, that the warning had been filed rather than acted upon. Another pointed out that the volume of material received at routing desks made such outcomes almost inevitable, unless priorities were signalled more clearly. The problem, as they framed it, was not only what had been written, but how it had been framed and classified. The lieutenant commander, reading the minutes later, saw his own language quoted. He had written that a patrol line appeared to be forming and that the evidence suggested a grouping of boats. He had refrained from stronger wording because the data had been incomplete. The doctrine of the time discouraged categorical statements based on limited information. Under the pressure of hindsight, those cautious phrases could look like missed opportunities. He knew, and those around him knew, that changing a few words in one note did not guarantee a different outcome. Convoys had to cross the Atlantic. The enemy had many submarines. Total safety was not possible. However, the review did not stop at individual phrasing. It examined the system through which warnings travelled. The papers show that in the months after this and similar incidents, the steps were taken to refine the process. Certain types of analytic appreciation were given clearer markings to indicate when they involved a significantly increased risk in a specific area. Distribution lists were adjusted so that routing officers received shorter, more focused warnings alongside the full situation reports. Internal instructions reminded desk officers at all levels to highlight and follow up on such warnings. The measures were not dramatic. They did not add new ships or aircraft. They did not alter the basic realities of the campaign. But they addressed a recurring theme that had been exposed by this convoy's experience: the tendency of some warnings to be acknowledged in theory and diluted in practice, buried among many other notes and memoranda. From the perspective of the men at sea, these administrative adjustments were invisible. The next convoy sailed and faced its own set of hazards. In the tracking room, the lieutenant commander continued his routine. He came on watch, read signals, adjusted pins and lines, drafted notes. The memory of the convoy that had been caught in the newly formed patrol line did not fade quickly. The casualties were noted in the official lists, and privately the staff remembered the set of days when their charts had filled with reports from that area. For him, the lesson was not that one note could have prevented the losses, but that the connection between analysis and decision needed constant reinforcement. The Battle of the Atlantic evolved in the months that followed. Additional long-range aircraft came into service, and more escort carriers and support groups operated in the mid-ocean. Changes in Allied tactics and improvements in intelligence began to turn the statistical balance. By late spring and summer of 1943, convoy losses declined. The charts in the tracking room showed fewer clusters of sinkings along any single route, but the experience of earlier months remained in the institutional memory. The files, with their appended notes and minutes, preserved the record. The phrase filed rather than acted upon, written in one set of review minutes and echoed in others, became a quiet warning of its own. It reminded staff that information, however carefully gathered and analysed, could lose much of its value if not translated into timely and tangible operational decisions. In later post-war accounts published in official histories and memoirs, the emphasis often fell on the broader factors that contributed to victory at sea: industry, technology, tactics, and code-breaking. Within those accounts, there are occasional references to the internal organisation of the Admiralty and Western Approaches staff and to the gradual improvement of procedures. The lieutenant commander's name appears, if at all, only in internal memoranda and distribution lists. His note about the forming patrol line remains one item among thousands in the archives. Yet his experience and the experience of the convoy that crossed that patrolled band illustrate a recurrent feature of large wartime organizations. Warnings do not simply exist or fail. They are written by individuals, shaped by doctrine and habit, transmitted through systems and received by others under their own pressures. And at each stage there are chances for emphasis to be lost or gained. In early 1943, the Allied Naval Command System was still working through these realities under operational pressure. The convoy that met the patrol line did so not because anyone intended to expose it, but because decisions were taken within a complex set of constraints and imperfect information. The subsequent attempt to understand what had happened and to adjust the process was part of the wider shift toward more integrated intelligence and operations that characterized the later war period. By the time peace returned, the rooms in the Admiralty had changed. The charts were cleared, the pins and lines were removed. Some of the officers returned to their pre-war professions, others stayed in naval service. The documents remained. In them, among the many signals, summaries and notes, are the records of days when a convoy set out along a route that crossed a band of ocean watched by submarines, and of the assessments that existed beforehand. They do not offer simple conclusions, they show instead how information moved, how decisions were made, and how afterward those involved tried to learn from both their successes and their failures.